Good evening and welcome to The Table, a new discussion show here on Byline TV where we aim to have long, serious, productive, factually based conversations about the things that matter with people we might not always agree with. At this table there's no hiding behind sound bites, and over the next hour every position must be justified and no topic is off the table. Well, tonight I'm joined by Femi Oluwole, an anti-Brexit activist and political commentator, Benjamin Butterworth, who's the late editor at the iPaper, and Benjamin Loughnane, research fellow for migration at the Conservative-aligned Bow Group. Tonight we'll be looking at the fallout from the confidence vote Prime Minister Boris Johnson faced earlier this week, which he won by 211 votes to 148. 41% of Tory MPs were unimpressed by Johnson's attempt to brush aside the Sue Gray report, which was all about law breaking in number 10 and failures of leadership at a very high level. We'll be getting stuck into what Johnson calls the people's priorities, whatever they are, beyond calling pints of bitter pints. Well, gentlemen, thank you for joining me. The obvious first question is, can Boris Johnson survive? Who wants to have first go at that?
Well, I'll go for it. I think Boris Johnson can survive because he seems to have the character of being able to evade any responsibility whatsoever, and he's always had this ability. Anytime he's got fired from a job, he's been promoted to an even better job within a couple of years. I think, if he gets kicked out as Prime Minister, he'll be Pope by 2030.
His bosses were always, let's put it this way, rich fellow Conservatives. Yeah. And now these bosses are the British people. That's
ostensibly.
Yes, and what is more, a Conservative Party in Parliament that is looking down the barrel of doom at the next election if it carries on like this. Do you think that he can survive despite that?
Well, his boss is the British public, in terms of technically. But as Nadine Dorries sort of admitted on TV, the donors have spoken.
40 donors worth 80 billion.
Indeed. So I think the reality is the people who are his paymasters and people who have the ability to decide when he goes and how are the donors, not the British public.
Femi, what do you think?
I found that incredible. Nadine Dorries just choosing to score an own goal on national television by saying that they're not. It doesn't matter if he broke the law. It doesn't matter if people don't want him. It doesn't matter what the polls are saying. All that matters is the donors, and that's what he wants. He wanted Tory MPs to think about.
Why do we think your think tank is the oldest Conservative think tank in the world? Why would so many rich people be so concerned about one particular Conservative leader? What does he represent to them, do we think? I'll bring you in a minute.
I suppose the fact that they know him, he's predictable, they know how he's going to...
He's unpredictable, that's the problem.
He's predictable for their purposes, maybe not in terms of his personal conduct, but in terms of what his policies are going to be towards business, for example, they know he's fairly stable and predictable. So he's serving their interests perfectly well at the moment, and so there's no reason to get rid of him. The moment he stops serving their interests, he'll be gone.
Do you think he could be gone sooner than that?
I think he should be. I suspect he won't be. You asked the question of why do the big donors like him so much? Well, probably because they can give him a call and tell him, the Prime Minister, directly what they want from the government. If there's one thing we saw from the pandemic, it was the totally inappropriate relationships that he and his ministers have had with big business, with wealthy individuals. And so I can imagine they feel quite a personal alignment. But kind of the question that I always think for Conservatives, and maybe this goes for Ben, but is why are they so aligned to him? And you sort of hit on it, because this is a guy who was a liberal pro-EU mayor of London, who became the right-wing rebel Tory leader, who's now a tax and spend Prime Minister. And so you kind of wonder, what does the guy stand for? And actually, if I were a Conservative MP, I'd feel quite unsure about this guy because you don't know what's coming next.
I actually asked David Davis yesterday. He was outside Parliament, and I said, "All right, what do you think it's time for a new direction?" And he said, "Yeah, because basically the Conservative Party is supposed to be about small government. It's supposed to be about low tax. It's supposed to be about not getting involved in people's lives. And yet this is the government of the highest taxes since about the 1950s. They're banning protests, and which their own Human Rights Committee says is against their human rights." And they're suppressing rights, and they're basically doing everything that you would think would be against traditional Conservative values.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think the online harms bill as well, online safety bill, I think they've renamed it now, and the increase in taxes and so on and so forth, they're not Conservative policies. But the question is, do they affect his donors? And as long as they don't, I think it'll be okay.
But there is something about the Conservative Party that they will do anything to stay in power.
Yeah.
The fact that their central policies are answering the questions, the problems that they've caused in the last 12 years is both remarkable and incredibly clever because, they're using their own mistakes to keep themselves there.
We'll come in a bit to try to characterise what kind of conservatism Johnsonism has been, if this is indeed the final curtain for it. But I just want to maybe ask all of you to consider this. This is the letter from Jessie Norman MP from Hereford and South Herefordshire, and it was one of the bombshells chucked into the debate on the day of the vote. To me, it's stunningly clear. He says, look, the Rwanda policy is ugly. He says we shouldn't be banning noisy demonstrations. That's not a Conservative thing to do. And then quotes, thirdly, under you, the government seems to lack a sense of mission. It has a large majority, but no long-term plan. There is no sign, for example, that it has even begun to get to grips with the need for greater security and resilience in a range of policy areas. Rather, you are simply seeking to campaign, to keep changing the subject, and to create political and cultural dividing lines, mainly for your advantage, while the economy, he goes on, is tanking. Femi, we're not Conservatives. That is a Conservative voice passing judgment. Does it sound to you like something close to the judgment that history might pass on Boris Johnson?
I think so. I mean, when you look at, he mentions there the notion of keep changing the subject in order to stay in power, and I think that's what's happened. You had austerity, and then they've kind of avoided judgment for austerity by introducing Brexit, and they kind of avoided judgment for the damage of Brexit by their handling of COVID, and they kind of avoided judgment for the COVID because of their handling of Ukraine and Russia. It's just scandal after scandal. And then Partygate got them out of that. So it's just the next thing. Let's talk about the next thing, and they never seem to get judged for any of it.
There's a trope within Conservatism about its adaptation. Going back to the time of Pitt. This is a party that adapts to the new realities of British capitalism over and over again. But have we kind of reached the limits of that? Because the content is what Jessie Norman, who's, I would say, is a one-nation Conservative, he's saying, look, this is so far from our values, we've got to kind of pull back to something that isn't just adaptation.
I think one of the things about Boris, obviously as a former journalist, is he understands the news cycle sort of intimately well, and he understands that if you've got a bad story, you can just force it off the headlines with another story. And so he sort of has that consciousness, which I think previous prime ministers, they might have understood, but not in the same way as someone who has actually sort of been in the invention of the sausage, as it were. So I do think there is a sense of, whatever the current thing is, just moving it along, moving the story along. Does Boris have any values? No, probably not. He believes in keeping himself in power, and that's the only ideology he has.
It's quite, before I come to you, Benjamin Butterworth, it's quite, you see, I'm from a political generation where Conservatives did have values, although I didn't agree with them. I probably would have agreed with Harold Macmillan. I was a little bit too late for that. It's quite weird to be hearing people of your generation okay with the idea that we've got a political leadership that doesn't have values.
I'm not okay with it.
No. But even that it's not a surprise. I mean, in the sense that you're staring at, I would say, a kind of Nietzschean figure here, who our political system was not really designed for such people to find their way to the top of it. So, where do you think the party has to go next?
Well, I think, some years in the wilderness out of power, reassessing what it actually believes in wouldn't be a bad thing.
And Benjamin Butterworth?
I mean, they certainly don't think that. And I think generally when parties lose power, they tend to spin off further out of touch rather than find themselves. The Labour Party is living proof of that. Or indeed, when Labour was in power, the Conservatives just went ever further away. So, the truth is that they don't have a core to why they're there. They don't have a reason to be there other than, as you referred to earlier, simply being in power. And I think that's a central problem. But also the reason that I don't buy this idea that Boris Johnson is going to be a winner in perpetuity is because winning parties have a reason for people to vote. Brexit was an extremely strong reason to get a big group of people to vote Conservative. You look at David Cameron, he had the long-term economic plan. It was a clear thing people could grasp. You had Tony Blair, you can still give the slogans now, education, education, tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime. We all know those messages. But if you were to say, what are Boris Johnson's messages? What is his reason to be there? I think very few people would be able to give you an answer to that. And that's why I think if the British public get a say, I don't fancy his chances that well.
We'll come to what we think the British public thinks in a minute, but I just want to think about, for now, just anatomising what happened in that no confidence vote. To me, it looks like this. We've got a bunch of people who were, the easiest people to identify are the remaining Remainers. There are still some remaining Remainers who have survived. Then you've got the hard Brexiteers, like Steve Baker, who's given up on him, and are probably thinking we do need to go actually even harder into a clearer trade and political break with Europe. The Northern Ireland Protocol, for me, is just a kind of proxy issue for that. And then you've got these people like Jesse Norman, the patrician One Nationers, and they do feel when you speak to them, that in their constituencies, you'll find them saying, we're really proud that the Kurdish community votes for us, and they're connected to a real life that often the old patricians weren't. Now, those three sets of people, if I've got it right, don't have any common interest. No. What would it take? What kind of alliance could come out of that moves it from 148 to where it needs to be?
I think one of the problems with Boris is he's tried to please everyone, and in doing so he's annoyed everyone. That's why you have all of these different groups who seem to have turned against him, because in trying to please everyone, they've all sort of seen through it, and so that's why they all now turn on him. So your Brexit Spartans, your sort of Steve Baker and so on and so forth, don't like him because they see him as betraying the principles of Brexit, because despite saying get Brexit done, all the sloganeering, he hasn't actually used the opportunity that Brexit provided in order to then, create new opportunities. That's the chagrin that they have with him there. The Remainers, of course, have very clear reasons to not like him. They didn't like him from the start. And then your sort of principled One Nation Tories, I think, don't like him just because he's bad for the party. He's bad for the image of the party. He makes it look like a scurrilous, dishonest, grasping party rather than one which has principles and honour and defends ideas like law and order.
So I struggle with that because it's yes, there were these pre-existing reasons, be they Brexit, be they the anti-liberalism, populism, suppressing freedom of speech, etc. Those things that existed before Partygate, but those things existed before Partygate. Sure. That's the whole point. Yeah. And these all the politicians who were in the Conservative Party signed up to Boris Johnson. Now, if you look at what Partygate was, the reason why it's such a scandal is because A, Boris Johnson broke the law. B, Boris Johnson lied to the people. C, he showed that he didn't really care about people because he was willing to laugh about it. Yeah. Now, are these things people knew before? That he's willing to lie. He got fired twice for lying. That he's willing to break the law. He broke Parliament illegally. That he's willing to put the country behind his own self-interest. In 2011 and 2013, he said that Brexit would be bad for the UK, and he said that no UK Prime Minister would ever change our membership of the single market. And then he supported Brexit in order to become Prime Minister. He's proven all three things. All politicians signed up to this. All the Tories, at least. So to then claim that somehow, just waking up, that Partygate was just big revelation, we can't be part of this.
No, I don't think Partygate was. I think it's overblown. If you look at his favourability, he went down 27 points before Partygate broke the story. And since then, he's gone down an additional 12 points in favourability. But the thing that really damaged him was the failure to deliver over the past couple of years. Before Partygate even broke as a story, he'd already lost the support of the party in the country.
But I don't, not necessarily give my own opinion on this, but I don't think that's true, because actually, I think when it comes to Brexit and it comes to COVID, popular opinion is that he did deliver what he'd say. And actually, that is why he's sustained some level of support. And there is a reasonable chunk of people in this country that will defend him because he delivered on those two things that feel quite tangible, the vaccine and getting us out of the EU.
Within the Conservative Party, within the wider public, the polls have been consistently anti-Brexit since about 2018.
Well, you cling on to that, but I tell you what, the Conservatives will be in power in perpetuity if that's the argument that they're left.
No, but it's the truth. Like, please, point
the
to
truth. I mean, it's simply not the truth.
Well, in the 2000, we've had since 2016, we've had two chances and two chances alone to give a say on Brexit. 2017, the majority voted for parties that were committed to A, avoiding no deal, B, staying in the single market. Yes, the majority, because the Labour Party was pro-Brexit, but in 2019, the majority went to parties that were in favour of a second referendum. We have not shown support of Brexit in a very long time.
The polls are pretty clear that there are two problems that Labour had that helped the Conservatives enormously. One was that they had Jeremy Corbyn, who, for a certain type of traditional Labour voter, they felt uncomfortable with, they felt like he didn't love the country.
Sure.
And the other is that there was a type of Labour voter that was very effective when you put the electoral maths in, that turned because they supported Brexit. And you will not get those people back without it. And the truth is, I think you walk straight in to Boris Johnson's best trap, which is to say that, oh, they want to get rid of me because they want to get rid of Brexit. Oh, this is just a Remainer plot. Making that argument is his last best hope.
And that's the mistake Selwood made, coming out and saying we need to get back into the single market, was probably one of the things that helped Boris scrape through. Yes, because it just threw a hand grenade into the whole debate. If it had been about Partygate and honour and honesty and not lying to Parliament, it's very possible Boris wouldn't be the Prime Minister right now.
Well, that's what the MPs think. What do we think? What do we think that the British people are telling us? I mean, I've been out and about a bit this week in Manchester. There's a massively anti-political mood everywhere, but the phone lines are buzzing to these daytime talk shows about the cost of living. That's my experience. I mean, I was on a Nicky Campbell show, and people were saying they'd seen people driving Audis up to I don't know which model Audi, but Audis are not bargain basement cars, to food banks. And people are panicking about their bills, cutting themselves off. That's where I feel. That's what I feel is kind of behind a lot of the angst that's feeding its way through to the Tory backbenches. Do any of you feel different?
Well, may I just put something back to you? Because you say that you've been going around Manchester and the country. You've been around for longer than the rest of us around this table.
Thank you.
How does this anti-politics sentiment compare to, say, the expenses scandal or the Iraq war? What sort of perspective do you have?
I think it was strong during the expenses scandal, and that's partly what's driven it. The Iraq war is different because the Iraq war, you saw school children come out of their schools aged 13 and go on strike, in the sense that there was a distrust of politics. But when I say anti-politics, I mean a switch off from politics. Yeah. Because Keir Starmer, whatever you think about him, has not set the world on fire. Ed Davey, who? Nicola Sturgeon, up there, as long as you're not Scottish, it doesn't matter. And then you've got this continuous clown car, this fascinating spectacle of Johnson and his Camarilla. It's not just Boris, it's the family. And people look at that, and at the same time, I think they are worried about the cost of living. They're worried, obviously, about Ukraine. We shouldn't forget that. And to my answer to you is, I think it's with every generation that comes along. You as a social media producer, you were saying to me earlier, you have several generations. I would imagine the Gen Z generation, they're very engaged with politics, small p. But am I right in saying that, in fact, they look at this as a spectacle that might as well be going on, sort of on the top of an alpine valley somewhere that they will never get to?
So during the Brexit years, I went to many, many schools and spoke to 16, 17-year-olds, and the first question I'd ask is, who here cares about politics? And most of the time, 1, 2, 3 hands would go up. The next question I'd ask is, who here cares whether or not you can get treated in the NHS? Whether or not you can get a job when you leave school, how much stuff costs in the shops? All the hands go up. I say that's politics. And I get it, because a lot of the Gen Zs are more engaged in politics in both P and Big P than I was. And that was because I was born in Darlington, I grew up in Birmingham. Politics was just old men shouting at each other down in London hundreds of miles away. That connection between those small P political issues that we deal with on a regular basis and the politicians in Parliament, that's very much lost on a lot of people. And I think that gets worse as each generation goes on, because people feel that their votes don't really count. And objectively, they don't. I mean, if you've got consistently a voting system whereby a party with a minority of the votes gets a majority of the seats, that means the majority of votes mean literally nothing, because a party with a minority has a controlling majority.
Okay. Benjamin Loughnane, you presumably in your workplace have people who are connected to various parts of the Conservative grassroots. How's it feeling out there?
Well, I think it goes back to the small p politics idea. I think a lot of people are more concerned about cost of living, whether their bins are collected on time. Those are the very basic things, the heating bills going up, cost of food, etc. Things like Ukraine are great for the headlines and great for his polling, all the rest of it, but it's not what's going to save his skin. What's going to save his skin is getting the cost of living down. If he can do that, I think he'll probably be okay. If costs continue to mount, I think discontent will grow among the grassroots and he won't have that much longer left.
I mean, I was going to ask you that I think I'm right in saying that the Boer Group are pretty neoclassical in their approach to economics.
Yeah.
This is a Prime Minister and a Chancellor who, in practice, what happens? Political pressure builds for emergency action. The emergency action is always giving money to people for current spending. Yeah. Which is a very strange thing to be seeing a Conservative. I've spoken to Labour people, and I am a member of the Labour Party, who are saying there's no way we could have got away with chucking 21 billion into people's daily spending.
Well, it's like how the Blair government were actually quite strict on immigration. They could get away with it because Labour could get away with that sort of thing, whereas the Tories would immediately, the press would jump down their throat for it. In the same way, the Tories can get away with big spending projects, which Labour couldn't get away with, because they don't have the reputation for it. They're known for being good on keeping taxes and spending low.
Yeah, I always point out that borrowing was lower under Tony Blair than it was Margaret Thatcher, David Cameron, Theresa May, or Boris Johnson. So the myth that Labour borrows more, because Labour, it's too sensitive an issue for Labour to dare do things like that if it feels it can win. But this question of the cost of living crisis, there is clearly a considerable group of people in the country for whom 8.5% inflation is crippling, a 50% rise in utility bills is crippling. Maybe the bottom third, that is a very serious issue that's preventing their daily lives. But I actually question the reality of the word crisis for the rest of the people, because we just had 2.5 years of paying a lot of people's wages and them spending a lot less than they normally would. There's about £200 billion more in savings than there was a couple of years ago. And the truth is...
What's your point, though?
The truth is that one of the problems that's driving inflation is that prices for things like travel, entertainment, holidays, all those things have gone up and they're able to pay it, which is keeping the inflation high. So the government is spending billions and billions on giving them bailouts like the 400 quid for the heating, when actually there's a big chunk of people that can afford it. They don't like it, it's not good, but the idea that everyone is in a crisis just isn't true.
So I mean, I think we could accept that might be true, but when you speak to the comfortably off 35 to 55, not comfortably off, people with a decent job, say in the public sector, they're mad as hell. I mean, they're mad as hell about a lot of things. Some still obviously mad as hell about Brexit. Some really, I mean, because if you've got to say to your child, don't steal, your school friend's lollipop, or when you have done, you must confess it and say sorry. And then, they say, but look, mummy, Boris Johnson. I feel there's a lot of, just as it was in Middle America over Trump, a lot of disgust about the behavioural and moral aspect of this administration.
I'm not sure anyone looks up to Boris Johnson as a moral beacon. I don't think any children are going, look, mummy, the Prime Minister's doing. I think everyone knows what he's doing is a bit mucky. And I think there is a sense
more
in
like
politics...
say, look, mummy, is that daddy? I mean,
it could be, Statistically, very likely.
Let's not libel anybody. Let me say for the record that we are making no suggestions about the paternity of any child in this country.
I'm fairly certain it's not mine.
So okay, can the Conservative Party in office survive the public mood that we think we have just sort of anatomised? You were saying you think he can, but there are events, aren't there, dear boy? There are events to come.
I think the better way of putting it is, if anyone can, he can.
Yeah. The greased piglet.
I think anyone else would have been done by now, but he's got a way of evading the butcher's knife quite skillfully.
So I think it's about the suffering that people are going through, because yes, it may be only, as you refer to, a third that are in what you refer to as crippled. But that is a crisis in and of itself. A third of people at that level, that is a crisis. And the reason why Partygate, more than anything else, has been the thing that's really tipped the dial in terms of Boris Johnson's popularity is because people are suffering. And so when the people are suffering and struggling to feed their kids, heat their homes, etc., they need to know that the politicians in charge actually care about them. And so if they are struggling to just make basic ends meet, and they look to the politicians and they're laughing about them, then that's the exact thing that's going to really bring down the Conservative Party. And as for the future, Boris Johnson will stay until the end of the year, in my view, because obviously I don't think they can call a no confidence vote within another 12 months. Moving forward, we've already seen their priorities. It's the donors. It's the fact that they've already signed up to this. It's the fact that they don't know if they've got anybody else left. I spoke to Ben Bradley yesterday, and I asked him, Boris Johnson's broken the law, why did you vote for him? And he said, well, I don't have anybody, so that's wrong. He said, Boris Johnson connects with his people, his constituents, more than any other politician in the Conservative Party.
This is Mansfield, isn't it?
In Mansfield, yes. And I was like, well, there are two sides of that. Either you're saying that no other politician in the Conservative Party could actually deliver for those areas, or no other politician in the Conservative Party is actually trusted by those areas. And the polling shows that people are against him. So why is he still in power?
Well, let's look at the runners and riders for a bit. I mean,
Are there any?
Well, there are people who clearly think they are. I mean, I think Liz Truss's photography bill is close to the limit of what you would reasonably expect it to be. There's a lot of regal bearing being shown by Liz Truss. I've noticed a sort of equally regal bearing being shown by the former Defence Secretary Penny Mordaunt.
Yeah.
One or two people are sort of putting. Jeremy Hunt was sort of flying his flag. I know you're sort of frowning here, but they've got to think. They wouldn't do this unless they thought it's possible.
I think it takes more than thinking you can be Prime Minister to actually become Prime Minister. You actually need to have support and also a policy platform. What does Liz Truss believe in? One policy. You mean one policy?
Pork markets.
What is Truss? Yeah, pork markets in Beijing.
I'll give you an example. I think although as a Labour member I'll be very critical of the government's handling of Ukraine, I think it's fair to say that they've put that their actions have been guided by strategy.
Right.
I was in Germany 2 weeks ago and Austria, and you even compare equally, sort of politicians of equal stature like Scholz, Baerbock, etc. I'd say, I don't want to kind of put money on Liz Truss, but I'd say, look, turning up in a big Russian hat in Kiev and
when it was about 18
degrees, is a thing. Hunt clearly is trying to build don't we think, some kind of alliance of the softies.
He's not got a chance.
Right.
The first person to blow the whistle was never the one who wins in any case, and I think Hunt jumped the gun far too much the other day.
I mean, I think Jeremy Hunt obviously had his go and lost quite clearly.
Yeah.
And I think he's a very respectable man. I would respect him as a politician, as an individual. I think he has, a sense of public service, but he's not going to be the Prime Minister.
He was actually, as Health Secretary, people who worked with him said he literally ended up doing what Nye Bevan said in the inauguration of the NHS. If a bedpan, falls to the floor in South Wales, the Secretary of State must know about it. And Hunt was micromanaging hospitals. There's good and bad about that, but it shows a level of dedication. I mean,
he wasn't particularly popular among doctors.
No, I don't.
Very unpopular.
Especially the junior ones.
But let's face it, the NHS brief is a poison chalice to every.
He made some serious missteps, though. Attempting to close A&Es across the country, for example, was just a shocking decision for the Health Secretary.
But going back to the question of whether they believe in anything, well, actually, I think Liz Truss does offer an ideological position. She is a low-tax, small-state, Institute of Economic Affairs style politician. I think that is a clear version of the Conservative Party that a lot of the MPs rather like. Whether she has the killer instinct to get there, I'm not convinced.
The problem is, it's not just 9% inflation, and possibly RPI inflation, in double figures already. It's stagnant economy. It's energy security crisis, whatever you would say, but we are facing, coming down the road, an energy security problem. We are going to need a nuclear power station per year and a lot of offshore wind. None of that can be done with a small state. Or maybe it can. Maybe the Bow Group can tell us how you make Brexit work with a small state at a time when the economy is stagnant and we've already borrowed, 350 billion plus extra since COVID hit us. How does that look to you?
Well, I think, reducing the size of the state, the obvious benefit is that you reduce the tax burden and that increases, the people's disposable income and so on and so forth. What you're talking about in terms of these grand projects, I don't think that's what people need at the moment. They just need to eat and heat their homes. We need to stop these sort of great ideas about fixing the world and just get things a bit closer to home.
But surely one of the things that's making them not have the money to heat their homes is the cost of petrol. And so if you do actually deal with the energy crisis by investing in things such as what Paul was suggesting, that is how you deal with that.
But there's other solutions to that as well. For example, where we source our energy from, one of the things that's really affected the prices is the situation in Russia, for example, Russia and Ukraine. So there are other things which are completely apart from those grand projects, foreign policy, for example, which have an effect on that. It's not as simple as saying, well, we'll invest loads of money in this and that will fix the problem.
But there's not many places we can get oil from that's not Russia.
Well, the North Sea.
North Sea, yeah.
I mean, in the end, there is a faction of the Conservative Party, isn't there, that does want to dump zero net carbon by 2050.
I think the idea of net zero is misleading anyway. You can achieve net zero by planting more trees. That doesn't mean you've actually reduced the amount you're using or how much you're taking in. I think it's a distraction. You need to look at what the actual usage is rather than just saying, well, we've planted a load of trees, so that's fine.
A lot of trees will be needed to get to net zero by 2050. But the argument is, and standing back and trying to avoid being in that argument, I'm just thinking it's going to be a brave government of any G20 country that starts stepping back from the Paris Accord commitments. You might get it under Trump in 2024 or a Trump-like candidate, but you'd be brave to go before that.
I'd say brave is an interesting term.
Stupid, I was thinking, but I'm trying to be objective here.
But it's not the will of the people either. Net zero and environmental issues are very high in lots of polling. In fact, at the moment, in this post-Brexit Britain, frequently the environment ranks above immigration.
Yeah, well, I care about the environment, but I just don't think the net zero agenda is the way to solve it. I don't think that's the solution. I think it's a distraction tactic to say, oh, well, look, we're doing something. But it's a very expensive policy which doesn't achieve what it says it does.
But you can't at the same time say investing in offshore wind and nuclear power is a distraction but say the problem is that it's about planting trees, which doesn't actually offset. We're looking for ways that.
Well, I'm not saying the solution is to plant trees. I'm saying that the current policy package around the environment doesn't solve the issues that it claims to. And so what it is it's about having the PR to say, look, we're ESG compliant in every sense, but does it actually achieve what you're saying it does? Does it help the environment?
It's quite interesting, isn't it, what happened in Australia? You had almost a climate denying, certainly climate skeptic Aussie government addicted to coal. They had a very strong political Australian politics is basically fixed. The donors don't need to have intermediaries. They basically control the political parties. And yet, what happened is that Australian conservatism fell apart over the climate issue. And you got these liberal, younger, female, so-called teal, so mixture of blue and green candidates. If the Tories go too far down that route, you are going to see some of the younger generation especially because it remains a party that is rooted in the southern, rural demographic. You don't think that's a potential problem?
It is a problem, but I don't think it's as big a problem as certain other issues. I think there's bigger fish to fry. And the current policy, I think, is one which pleases nobody. So people who are against the sort of environmentalist approach in general don't like it, and the people who are environmentalists also don't like it because they don't think that it does the job.
Yeah.
So people like Extinction Rebellion and Animal Rebellion and all of these groups don't agree with the government's policy.
The people between climate change and Extinction Rebellion is called the country. So most people are in that group.
And not to mention, we're attacking the notion of reaching net zero based on conservative policies, and that's kind of the problem.
Before we move on, let's have this as an exam question. I'll start with you, Benjamin Loughnane, because you are a Conservative. If you're talking to a GCSE student and the question is, what are the principles of conservatism? After this week, what's the answer?
Well, the principles of conservatism in the abstract theoretical sense is to do with locality, community. Obviously the party and the government do not represent those things. They're focused on power and preserving their own power and keeping their party in power, and that's effectively what they do. So there's a disconnect, of course, between the party. That's why you refer to small c conservatism and big C conservatism, i.e. the party and the principle are completely distinct.
I was just been thinking about the writings of the famous conservative philosopher Michael Oakeshott, who, to my generation, was the person who defined what it is. And you think about he came up with that, I can't remember it from memory, the metaphor is of a ship that basically it's not really going anywhere. It just has to move steadily along and not sink and not make any violent sort of moves. And that was a metaphor that probably stuck with us even throughout Thatcherism, because Thatcherism was a revolution, and yet once it was over, you could still be ministers talking about Victorian values and morality, and that it's just that it's gone, hasn't it?
I think that's what distinguishes it from progressivism. Progressivism is going towards some utopia, and you never really get there.
But wasn't Brexit a utopia in a way?
Well, yeah, whereas conservatism in principle is about the journey, not the destination. But I prefer the analogy that conservatism is planting a tree which you'll never sit under the shade of. So you put things into motion which you aren't necessarily going to benefit from, but have a long-term benefit rather than an immediate short-term.
Like building offshore wind and power stations.
Well, potentially, but what I mean to say is that the government are so focused on their own interests in the short term that they're not building any of those long-term plans regardless of what you think they should be.
I mean, I really couldn't disagree more. Frankly, I think the left would be true of the tree thing, because they tried to change the structure of society while a lot of people seem to do quite well quite quickly under Conservative governments. But you asked the question of what are the principles. Well, you'd say low tax, you'd say growing business or social conservatism. And the truth is, I think only one of those three this government is enacting, and it's resting on social conservative things like the culture war, like anti-transgender rhetoric, because it's failing to deliver on the others. And I think that's a pretty dangerous place to be.
Reasonable point, yeah.
And also, I think if you look at the election in Australia recently, well, actually, its incumbent right-wing Prime Minister was trying a similar tack, and it was one of the reasons he was thrown out, because eventually, even if there was a section of the electorate that had a sympathy to that kind of approach, they were like, well, we've got real issues to deal with. And I think that's the situation we find ourselves in now. And the danger is that Keir Starmer and Labour look like they're more obsessed with those culture war questions than the Tories. So that's why they're constantly asked this ugly question of, the anatomy of what makes a woman. And so I think the danger there is whether, as things get worse, the Tories lean into those questions too much, because I think they'll fall over if they do.
Well, I think that the culture war it's a free, easy policy. It's something that you can pursue which doesn't cost you anything. You don't have to provide a costed plan for how you're going to fight the culture wars. So for both Keir Starmer and for Boris Johnson, it's very convenient to distract from the economy and from social issues and so on and so forth with the culture wars, because people get fired up about it, but it doesn't cost anything.
You've been an opponent not just of Brexit, but of conservatism in the social media environment you operate in. That is the culture war, that is the battlefield, isn't it? Is it in our interest? You could see there Jesse Norman, I keep coming back to this letter, I think it's a fantastic letter. He's basically saying, it's you're stirring this up. We know why it works, but can the left avoid it? I mean, the left progressive half of society, because those are the things that, when you speak to 16-year-olds, they're far more fired up around what we would call culture war issues than they are about anything economic.
Yeah, so I mean that's the thing. If you look at Gen Z, especially on platforms such as TikTok, climate change and social justice, those are the two things that are the biggest things for them. As for the left, from a political standpoint, it's about avoiding being discriminatory in our anti-discrimination. So the left needs to make sure that we're just as loud about regional inequality as we are about stuff like racism. Now, the reason why the left has had to often seem like it cares more about those personality politics, things like racism, gender equality, etc., than investment in the North, etc., is because if you're out of government, that's all you can do. Yeah. You can't say, I'm going to invest in this next year. I'm going to build you a new train line or bus service. And so that's why it's had to go down that route.
Yeah. But I'm specifically talking about Keir Starmer and Boris Johnson hijacking that. I can totally understand, for example, a student activist going on about the culture wars makes sense because that's what they care about. That's what they can change. But the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition should really be focusing on the things that matter at the moment, like the cost of living crisis, which is spiralling out of control.
So we can walk and chew gum. You can deal with that, but you can also deal with the fact that this is major for people's lives. Because, for example, Oxford University shows, based on their research, if you've got a black-sounding name, you have to send 80% more job applications to get a call back. Middle Eastern, it's 90%. These are stuff that affects people's ability to get money. So life in the UK passes through a filter of racism.
Yeah, I was going to say you're not so keen on the culture war agenda for
no, I hate it. But the truth is, the reason it's happening is cold, hard, cynical politics. The coalition, and this kind of goes back to where we started with this question, is that the coalition that put Boris Johnson in office was one of normal, routine Conservative voters and a small C Conservative former Labour voter. Now, the problem that they have, the fundamental problem, is how do you keep that particularly precarious coalition together? And one of the ways, I'm not sure how effective it is, but is this rhetoric about transgender issues and not taking the knee and being cynical to Black Lives Matter, because that then paints the left, the Labour Party, the Liberals as being of this distant elite that doesn't understand them. And so the reason the government pursues that agenda constantly but implicitly is because it's its best bet of keeping that Brexit coalition together. And that is the simple reason why they're doing it.
I take your point about there being a different coalition of small C Conservatives whilst economically right-wing. I get that. But we are talking about stuff that affects lots of people across the country, and it's easy to paint it as just culture wars. But if we don't address these things, people's lives get ruined.
No, I get that. The question isn't the rights and wrongs of it. It's why they're doing it, and they're doing it because it riles up regular folk who feel, for the very good point you made earlier, that they care more about protests in London than they do about building schools and getting them a job in.
Let's be really clear on this. We act like the Tories are winning because that's what most people support. They don't. In every election, other than 3 since the Second World War, the majority has voted for parties to the left of the Conservatives. We are a progressive voting country. Labour, Lib Dems, SNP, Greens. Majority of the vote in every election, other than 3 since World War II.
So I'm glad you comfort yourself with that, but
because we have a broken voting system.
It doesn't produce any governments of that sort, does it?
Which is why the whole point is that the left needs to work together to change the voting system.
This is how it looks to me when I'm on the doorstep. I mean, in my hometown, Lee. I mean, Lee was liberal in the 19th century, never conservative, even when there was no voters. Labour from the moment it could be, 1921, and went conservative 100 years later. I mean, and on the doorstep, the younger, more public sector orientated workers will still, and actually people in jobs, run out, as they did with me, in their slippers to take the leaflets and say, well done, can I join you? The problem is we have ageing populations. The famous Christmas tree graph of the demographics is very fat in the elderly population. They feel the world has changed for the worse. In many of these towns, you go on Facebook, the most popular website is old pictures of this town. And what's the most popular comment? It was great then. It is, to use the vernacular, shit now.
But then whose fault is that?
Absolutely. I mean, I would say personally, the series of governments, one after the other.
But it's that generation who, participated in a lot of that policy. It's, it's all well and good complaining about it, but when you've benefited off the lifestyles which created that change.
At least they've got houses to come in.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, some of these houses, actually, you can buy for 38 grand on a credit card if you wanted to. So what I'm saying is that the Labour, I'm going to turn to Labour in a minute, Labour candidates who in these 60 or 70 seats that they must win, even to have a chance of forming a government with the SNP and Lib Dems, that's their number one obsession of how do they speak to both groups, and I don't know whether or not you, Benjamin Butterworth, have any ideas about, well, what can Starmer do to take advantage of this state of chassis? Where should Labour be putting its firepower right now?
I mean, I think avoiding the culture war traps is the best strategy, because social media has completely distorted the sense of what the country.
And let's be clear, Labour are not
is.
right now banging on about any, not even. I mean, leave aside what you might call ephemeral culture war. Labour are not making a big thing about Rwanda. The really serious, they've opposed it, but that's not what's on the leaflet.
That's probably because they know it won't happen.
Yeah, exactly. But what?
I mean, I think the cost of living and the economy and the disreputability of, if that's a word, of Boris Johnson, I think are probably the best bets. And although it feels complicated and as though there is this myriad of questions they have to answer at the same time, I actually genuinely believe that the things that would elect a government now are the same things that they have been at every election. That if people feel they've got less money in their pocket, they feel less stable, they feel like their kids aren't going to do better than them, then they're not likely to vote for the incumbent government. And that is the situation right now. And that's the problem the Tories have. And I think Labour focusing on that is its best bet.
So I agree that those things need to be front and centre, but I'm really uncomfortable with this idea of demoting those issues to culture war. Yes, things like should we take the knee? That's the symbol of the issue behind it. Yes, what's a woman? Say gender and sex are two different things. Answered based on those two things. These things are easy to answer, but
apparently they're not,
because they're incompetent. They're just incompetent at politics. If somebody asks you what's a woman, you say, well, if you're talking about sex, ask your doctor. If you're talking about gender, ask somebody who goes to which section of a clothing store. Those questions are easy to answer. Go back to the basis thing of why you're taking a knee. Well, because as I said, if you're black, Middle Eastern, Asian, it's harder to get a job, and therefore life passes through a filter of racism. We need to address that. There are things we can do. Blind CVs, anonymized CV process, so that people aren't held back by either their name, their sex, where they come from in the country. Address regional inequality by that as well. There are things that can benefit everybody across the board, but instead they get caught up on the little symbolic things which you then refer to as culture wars.
Right, but I don't disagree with any of those individual arguments. I take the same conclusions as you on the individual arguments. But they're not what people elect governments on.
And it's also, why is there so much time being devoted to these questions when there are serious things which affect the vast majority of the population? And talking about something like gender obsessively and constantly...
Gender kind of affects a lot of people, because a lot of people kind of are a gender.
Okay, but it's not a huge swing issue for a lot of voters. What is the cost of living crisis and things like, local governance, whether their bins are being collected on time, those sorts of things people actually care about on a day-to-day basis.
Before I bring you back in, let me bring my perspective of ageing, as you put it so kindly earlier, to this. In the 90s, I think it was 1996, in South London where I live, there was a young black man killed in a police station, Brian Douglas. And there'd been violence. No police were prosecuted. We had a march. I mean, at that time, it would have been a kind of Black Lives Matter march. The Nation of Islam were there, his family were there, we, the white left, were there. There was about 1,000 of us, and we didn't even stop the traffic. The police just directed the traffic along to Kennington Police Station. In the same place, I saw the children and probably grandchildren of that generation. 30,000 turned out for Black Lives Matter in a lockdown. I mean, and this is, so it's same place, same community. It really matters to them. And of course, Labour will not win elections. It will not win power from Birmingham, from Bristol, from South London, but it cannot move away from those are primary concerns.
And talk about it and have a policy on it, but it shouldn't dominate all of the discussion and be constantly in the headlines.
I mean, I think it's fair to say it hasn't. But do you want to come back on this question? What would you, if you were advising Starmer now, do we swerve round the culture war? Do we stay on 9% inflation and cost of living? This is one question that the Labour MPs are asking, because there was a debate, I think it was Lisa Nandy versus others, saying, is it doing us any good focusing on Partygate and moral probity?
So after the Black Lives Matter protest in 2020, the Tories commissioned a report, and that report was deemed to by the United Nations to be seeking to normalise white supremacy.
This is
the Sewell report.
The Sewell report, yeah.
And one of the reasons why it did that was because that report included the stats that I mentioned about how if you've got a black-sounding name, you have to send out job applications to get a call back. But it said that that might not be race because of institutional racism. It might be just because employers assume that if somebody's from a certain race, that they're of a lower class. That link between, which obviously is racist, that link between classism and racism is clear. And stuff such as the blind CVs thing addresses both at the same time. Because if you don't see somebody's name when you're hiring somebody, or where they're from, or etc., you can hire much more fairly, and so you don't have this issue where people are constantly hiring people from private schools, people from London, and you can actually broaden things out and address inequality as a whole, regional, racial, gender, all those things, and that's how you unite the left behind that core principle of solving inequality.
So that's one view. What do you think?
I mean, the idea that talking about UN reports on government reports is some kind of argument that will win people over is so out of touch.
The end of what I just said.
But that simply isn't the way people think. And I just think that you walk into a trap. I was at the Black Lives Matter protest you referred to, and outside the US Embassy in Nine Elms in South London, and the police got on there, took the knee, and I thought it was very powerful. But should Labour constantly talk about those things? Well, no. And the truth is that you fall into the trap because, and this is a question, we've lived through this before, and although I was very young, maybe Paul may remember it, when Tony Blair came to power in 1997, that government changed attitudes on social issues faster than any government. I was going to say since Harold Wilson, but he changed the laws. I'm not sure he was able to change the attitudes so much. And he didn't. If you look at the 97 manifesto, it had almost nothing about LGBT rights. It said we'll stand up for inequality. But then once it got power, it was able to do things. And the danger is that if you obsess over those things, you let the people that are the enemies of everything you talk about push them back.
So what you just did was, sorry to say, it was an utter strawman. I explained how this is about introducing policies such as blind CVs. So you take inequality out of the hiring process so that anybody from anywhere, regardless of the background, can get a job. And you said that it was about taking the knee. I didn't mention taking the knee at all.
Okay, so what the focus here, because we're trying to keep it within a kind of problematic, and the problematic is the Tories look pretty crocked. And we need a Labour opposition that's prepared to give them a run at the next election. How does it look to you? I don't know whether you've ever done any political strategy, or you certainly, yeah. What's the real, sort of Mearsheimean realism? Tell us about what Labour should do.
Well, the reality is our politics has become Americanised, and even though we don't have a presidential system, people think presidentially now. Yeah. They think about Boris as a figurehead, and you need an opponent to Boris who can replace him. Even though it's not a presidential system, you have to play the game as though it is. So you need to get rid of Keir Starmer, effectively, sooner rather than later. And someone like Dan Jarvis or Wes Streeting, I think, could take Boris on. Nobody's
ever heard of Dan Jarvis. I mean, they've heard of Wes Streeting.
They haven't yet. But
very effective self-promoter.
But they would soon.
What do you think?
Well, look, I mean, Dan Jarvis isn't intellectually capable of being Prime Minister. He had a little run.
Boris Johnson is.
He had a little run at it during the Corbyn years. He spoke at a conference for the Progress, the Blairite think tank, and he's a very respectable man. I admire him, but he's not capable of the role. I think if you were to say to me who will be the next Labour Prime Minister, the answer would be Wes Streeting, and I'd put my money on that quite confidently. If you ask me,
why? Because we think Starmer's crocked, is he? Or we think he's been necking the Newcastle Brown Ale on camera in Durham.
This is boring.
I think you will have. I mean, who would be stupid enough to make predictions in this environment? But I suspect you'll have the Tories as the largest party, but probably not a majority. And then I think it is not a given that means that the Labour Party will then come in, because how naive would that be after the elections we've seen? But I think that's what will happen. I think the best result would be a Labour minority administration. But I've got a suspicion that if it is Boris Johnson, the right-wing media and those elements will kick in and probably get him over the line. But there definitely won't be a Labour majority, because you would need a swing the scale of Tony Blair in 97 just to get a majority of one.
I keep saying the way you deal with that is by an electoral pact. The Lib Dems and Labour need to work together. Otherwise, Boris Johnson the Tories, whoever's leading them, will win again.
There are different viewpoints about how the polling works on that. One MRP polling provider was saying to me the other day that the Lib Dems would also have to have a strategy that went beyond their kind of core middle-class southern, the places they already exist, they already represent. And it's not clear that they do. So okay, so but let's keep it on leadership. Do you think, Femi, that Starmer is the person? Supposing he gets over the problem of the fixed penalty notice, and most people on the inside think he will. That's why there's not a huge jockeying of position. What does he do? What should he do?
So I take the points about him being not particularly charismatic. I get that. Back when it was all up for grabs, I was thinking, my heart said go towards Jess Phillips, because I thought, well, we were in an area of personality politics. Who can I think of who has a habit of standing up against Boris Johnson in a way that people actually, that grabs headlines? Whereas Starmer's kind of a bit more boring. But we are where we are. As for how he's been so far, he's done, I think, as far as COVID went, I think he did okay. Because if we had a situation where every single week, every time that Boris Johnson tried to implement a lockdown or a new restriction, he was saying, no, we would do it this way, it would be seen as like just trying to drag the country down at a time of crisis. So I get that. As for, I think he should have been louder on issues to do with inequality, as I mentioned before. Moving forward, what he needs to do is he needs to commit firmly to what the majority of members, I think it was about 84% of members in Labour say, which is we need to support proportional representation, a change of the voting system, because everybody knows the votes don't count. If we talk about political apathy. Listen to me. We talk about political apathy. The reason why political apathy exists is because they think, well, it doesn't make a difference. That's because people feel that votes don't count.
Everything that you think would win the Labour an election will lose them an election. Talking about Brexit, talking about social issues, talking about electoral reform are not vote winners. That is the death of the Labour Party. And if Boris Johnson could write Labour's manifesto, it would be everything that you say.
And also PR would be better for Conservative parties, fringe Conservative parties, than it would be for the left.
Would be for Labour specifically?
Well, no, I'm saying for parties like the Brexit Party that have a huge number of MPs. You think that the ERG are bad, wait until you see Brexit Party.
I'm 100% down for there being UKIP MPs in Parliament if it means that we actually get a Parliament that's representative of the people, who, as I said before, is a progressive voting people.
Well, no, that's the mistake they made in Weimar, Germany, which led, as you saw, well, you know where that went.
The problem
didn't work out.
Suffice to say, the problem in Germany was not the fact that people had equal votes. It was kind of the opposite.
No, the proportional representation meant that politics was unable to function because there was too much fracturing. So there was no.
Maybe we could do a whole discussion about the Weimar Germany.
As a final point, there is one other country in Europe that uses our first past the post system, and that is Belarus, aka Europe's last dictatorship. Not exactly the model of democracy that we need to be aspiring to.
I don't think first past the post is their problem.
What we're doing here is, of course, we're dramatising the dilemma of Labour. I would say, regardless of your current party affiliation, that's kind of the Labour heart, and and what you've said is the Labour head. And when I meet Labour strategists and senior MPs, that's basically where they are. And it's not even a kind of academic discussion. The more they move away from your position, the more they lose to the Greens in places like Stroud, there are other places where the Greens are, and of course the SNP and the Scottish Greens. The more they do what you say,
they win.
Well,
here's the thing. Even in your best case scenario, you said that there would be a minority Labour government. That's the best you can hope for. And a minority Labour government would essentially have to be in coalition with other parties in order to run things. And the best way that you maximise that Labour strength is by having some degree of communication between those opposition parties in the election. And the best carrot that Labour can offer to those opposition parties is saying, hey, we'll make all your votes count in all future elections.
No, but I think...
Are you saying you advocate for, say, Labour not standing where the Liberals will win and vice versa?
Yeah.
Or not campaigning the way they're doing now. I mean, that's the maximum you can do.
I think, the fact that you sit there and say that we should have proportional representation because it's more democratic, but then you say we should deny people the choice of parties. That's the antithesis of democracy.
That argument is so cynical. We know,
no, it's not, because the Labour Party and the Liberal Democrats and the Greens and fringe parties on the right do not believe the same thing. People are entitled to a choice.
We're talking about one election so that all future elections in the UK are actually equal. As I said before, if consistently a party with a minority of the votes gets a majority of the seats, that means most votes in the UK throughout its entire history do not count for thing.
But that doesn't mean that you should stop people having a choice of the full parties that are likely to be
in one
power.
election in order to gain actual democracy for the rest of our country's future.
Benjamin Loughnane,
I just want to say you don't need to change the entire political system. You just need to change your leader. It's a lot simpler.
So,
than
That's personality politics at its worst.
as a representative of the oldest conservative think tank in the
Indeed.
world, who should replace Keir Starmer then?
Well, look, I don't really mind as long as he goes. As the main thing at the moment is that he can't win an election. You've got to run it on a presidential basis because that's how people think nowadays. Things have become Americanised. I wish they hadn't, but they have. And you need a much stronger character than someone like Keir Starmer, who, frankly, is just a bit limp. As I said, somebody like Wes Streeting, I think, would have
Why
a
do
good
you
shot.
always think? I know we're an all-male panel, but why do we always think about men? Because the Tories don't.
Well, I just went Jeff
yeah.
Phillips, but yeah.
I mean,
Yeah, no, exactly.
yeah,
She's not in the running now.
yeah.
I've voted, I've wanted Liz Kendall and Lisa Nandy. So, but other Labour Party supporters didn't seem to want them. I think Lisa Nandy would be a very effective Labour leader, actually. And I think she understands the North, in inverted commas. I hate the term.
She represents Wigan.
Exactly. But look, the thing this isn't unique to Labour, but I just wish that we'd have leaders that have a reason to be there other than wanting the job. David Cameron and Boris Johnson are prime examples, I think, of people who just felt it was their destiny. Yeah. And actually, I really respect Margaret Thatcher and Tony Blair because they had an argument to make and they kept coming back to it. And I want someone like that has a vision of what the country looks like at the end of their tenure.
Well, on that, we've gone from Boris Johnson being booed outside St Paul's Cathedral. We've gone from the various potential leadership candidates parading their wares in front of us. We've been through the philosophy of conservatism. We've been through Labour's problems. We've been through culture war versus economics. And it's time now, I think, to wrap it up. I will wrap it up by saying thank you to you, the viewer, for sticking with us. And thank you to my guests. I hope we like this format. We'll hopefully do it again next week. So thank you and good night.